now I am so excited to officially introduce our D&I event, Inclusive Leadership Beyond Unconscious Bias. We are so grateful for the partnership and commitment of our two sponsors, Holland and Knight and Stewart Law Group, and specifically the leadership of Mark Melton and Amy Stewart. I would like to introduce our panelists at this point. Aida Babalola is a Senior Director of Employment Law at PepsiCo Incorporated. She provides thought, partnership, and counseling on a broad range of employment matters, working closely with her HR clients and business partners to solve problems and help the business win in the marketplace while mitigating risk. Outside of day-to-day counseling, Aida also enjoys various work she does to support the DEI agenda at PepsiCo. We're also happy to have May Lee Ortiz, who is the Managing Counsel of Employment and Labor at Toyota Motor North America Incorporated, where she manages litigation, provides employment advice and counsel, develops training across the organization, and catalyzes strategic company initiatives. Her passions include mentoring, championing diversity and inclusion, and a personal blog, themaybe.com. I love that, May. She's immensely passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and mentoring, and she's even shared her thoughts and leadership at a 10-inspired talk for the Association of Corporate Counsel entitled Size Matters. So we are grateful to have you as well. And then I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Ramirez-Washka. She's an Associate General Counsel for the Boy Scouts of America. Oh, Elizabeth, I didn't tell you, my kid's an Eagle Scout. I know, isn't that so cool? Anyway, sorry. See, I always make it all about me. Sorry. She's also Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for the Boy Scouts. She is a corporate labor and employment attorney with substantial in-house legal experience on union avoidance strategy and union organizing campaigns, including neutrality agreements with Service Employees International Union and California Nurses Association. She's a former National Labor Relations Board field attorney and also has extensive trial experience. Next is Alvin Benton, who is stepping in today to assist with the Q&A aspect of today's discussion. Alvin is a Senior Director and Assistant General Counsel with Capital One. He is active in their diversity and inclusion committees and continues that passion with our chapter's D&I efforts as well. He's had numerous leadership positions, including the National Bar Association, and was nominated as a Rising Star by the Minority Corporate Counsel Association. Most importantly, though, Alvin is our star for the Dallas-Fort Worth chapter and currently serves as first vice president. And Mark Melton is a great friend to the ACC chapter and to the Dallas community. He is a tax attorney with Holland and Knight, and he focuses on corporate and federal income taxation issues related to domestic international transactions of private equity and hedge funds, as well as other investment partnerships, joint ventures, real estate investment trusts, and operating businesses. In addition to his professional activities, we know Mark is a passionate community guy who continuously gives back and serves in various leadership roles with several community service, civic, and political organizations. All right, guys, you've had enough of me today. And so with those introductions out of the way, Mark, our moderator, I'm going to hand it over to you. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Susan.
All right, thanks, Susan, and welcome, everyone. On behalf of Holland and Knight, we're proud to sponsor the diversity and inclusion events for the ACC and are pleased to be here, especially with this great panel. We're really excited to hear from them. Just as a few opening comments on why these types of discussions about diversity and inclusion, and especially implicit bias, are so important is, I think we all know when we're looking at talent and trying to make decisions in business, the larger the pool of people is, the more likely you are to find the most talented folks in that pool. And the unfortunate part about implicit bias, while it may have some historic good things about survival for the human race, is you make these snap judgments based on things that you're not even thinking about, just based on your own cultural history and where you come from, which is going to be different than anyone else that you were in a room with. And so you may not know you're making these decisions, but the effect of it in business is that you're limiting the pool of potential applicants in an irrational way. And so it's important to be aware that just as human beings, we have this tendency to exercise implicit bias in not helpful ways. And so we need to be aware that we do that so that we can be intentional about trying to overcome it. So with that, just setting the stage a little bit, May, if we could start with you, and I'm just always curious to ask, when you think about diversity and inclusion programs in your company, um, what have you seen that makes it important to you, and just what's your view on some of the things that I just said?
Yeah, I think, well, my first reaction to what you said is that I think people need to understand that it's not about judgment, right? It's not about choice. It's not about good people versus bad people. It's the fact that all of us have unconscious or implicit bias. And it's important for us to realize that, to move beyond it, right? Which is the name of this very panel.
Elizabeth, do you have some other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be, like you said, you have to be aware of it and try to minimize it and be intentional what you're doing. A good example is, for me, my unconscious bias is I tend to gravitate towards working moms, especially attorneys. So I live in the burbs and a lot of the moms don't work. So I need to be conscious of that. And as the Chief Diversity Officer of the Boy Scouts of America, we're a very old organization, predominantly white. And so my journey and looking at everyone is understanding what the biases are, understanding the culture. So I know how to put programs and implement things that are going to resonate, work. And it's just not one piece. It's not training. It's just a lot of combination of things, but we really need to understand the culture, who we are.
Right. And Aida, want to round out that comment?
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to belabor points that were already made. So I'm going to say I agree. And the one thing that I would highlight is just the point about everybody has implicit bias. And I think I was, well, I said I wasn't going to belabor, and look at me. I think I was shocked at coming to the realization that there were people that just assumed that they didn't, right? Or I should say the number of people that assumed that they didn't. And I think the biggest hurdle is just helping people to understand, to May's point, it's not good versus bad. It's not this group against this group. Everybody has a bias that is unique to that individual person. You could take two people that look the same, to Elizabeth's point, take two Black women out of the burbs. We have very different experiences. We are not a monolith. So we are also going to have different biases. And I think that's the biggest part for me that's exciting about this conversation, is unpacking that part.
Yeah, and if I may just add on that idea, the fact that so I took that Harvard implicit bias test or whatever, and it shocked me that I have implicit bias against women. Like, I'm a woman. Like, how is that possible? But that's the part where I talk about, you don't even realize the type of biases you may have, perhaps against a category that you yourself are.
Well, you shouldn't feel bad about that, May. I was doing a little research on this topic before the panel, and that's actually very common. And what the psychologists have said about that is that everyone tends to have a bias towards groups that they perceive to be more powerful. And so if you have a perception that men are more powerful than women, then perhaps you would have a bias towards them. So that's what all the research came out, which I thought was kind of an interesting thing. Another interesting tidbit, as I was just sitting here listening to you guys talk, I looked down at my notes here. And before we started this, I wrote down everyone's name so that I wouldn't forget, even though I know all of you. And I noticed that the first person's name that I wrote down was Alvin. And I was like, I wonder if why did I do that? I don't really know the answer to that, because I like May a lot better than Alvin. So I didn't write it down first, but it was just an interesting observation as I was thinking about this on why did I order the names the way that I did. So in your companies, obviously this is a topic that's been a hot discussion item for several years now. Do you guys have implicit bias trainings in your companies, or how do you approach this topic? And Elizabeth, let's start with you, to your comment about the Boy Scouts being historically dominated by white males.
Right. So because of that, one of the things I looked at is, right now, this is a hot topic. People are defensive about this topic, and we are predominantly a white organization. So one of the steps I took is to do training just on diversity, equity, inclusion, the foundation of what that means and how it aligns to the Scout Oath and Law, which to us is a tenet of the Boy Scouts. We're just talking about being kind, friendly, courteous, respectful, and letting out a foundation. So for next year, we're going to do unconscious bias, but I think it's level setting first, so people take off their defenses and don't say, Are you saying that I'm a racist? Are you saying this? To what May said, there's a judgment. There's not a judgment. So that's worked well for us now because we're a volunteer organization. So we're not a corporation where I can say, you will do this. It's getting buy-in, so it resonates. So the first step we did was just saying a foundation of what is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And people don't really understand equity. Even attorneys, they'll say, this is what equity is. I'm like, that's not the definition. So that's level set for us. And that's the start of our journey. And just understanding, like, again, understanding our culture and where we want to go.
And have there been certain training topics or themes that you have found have been more effective than others at breaking down those defenses?
Well, for us in the Boy Scouts, it's tying it to the Scout Oath and Law, which everyone's committed to, which is saying we're going to be kind, friendly, courteous. So they understand the premise of our organization on that, and then tying in diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is what that's about. Being, understanding people, being respectful and kind. So that's the first start we've done, and it's worked so far. Especially right now with people, it seems that the youth understand it. It's the adults are having more of the issues. And so we're a youth organization. The youth want to do it. The parents are concerned about it.
Well, I think there's probably a lot of categories where that's true, right? So, Aida, how about in your organization at Pepsi? How do you guys approach implicit bias, and do you do trainings, and what have you found works and doesn't work?
Yeah, we do. We have an unconscious bias training last year, and this is all public. If you go on PepsiCo's website, search REJ or Racial Equality Journey, you'll see a lot of this content, this information. But we launched an unconscious bias training last year that was mandatory for all executives in the organization. So everyone took it. And then this year that was cascaded a bit deeper into the organization. And it was also mandatory. So everyone's expected to take it by year end. And then, there's continued discussion on, okay, now how do you cascade that training even further into the organization, right? Frontline, et cetera. So, to Elizabeth's point, it's PepsiCo is not new to the DE&I space, to the journey, right? It's always been kind of a tenet, a principle for us, and part of why we succeed. That being said, I think last summer, for whatever reason, was a big reckoning point for a lot of organizations, right? For the country, I would say, for the world. And so it prompted, I think, a deeper dive or a deeper look into what are we doing, right? And how are we leveraging our size and scale to make impact, not just internally, but externally as well. But internally, one of those facets was unconscious bias training. We also saw a good amount of activity from our employee resource groups, right, who kind of took it upon themselves to host sessions like we had a global day of allyship, right, where the ERGs partnered together. And it was an amazing event where you talked about things like unconscious bias training, or unconscious biases, about different perspectives, cultural norms, et cetera. And I think that was really well received. The nice thing, I think you get a different thing from each type of training, right? An unconscious bias training that's instructor-led, gives you certain things that, to Elizabeth's point, it helps to level set, right? It gives foundational understanding, et cetera. I'll tell you from participating in the ERG experiences, I don't know, I thought those were uniquely impactful because in a lot of those sessions, people were willing to be pretty vulnerable about their personal experiences and how events were impacting them. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of been our journey in that space.
So I'd have to imagine in a company that large where, unlike Elizabeth, you can make this training mandatory. Certainly there has to be some level of dissent or resentment among certain people. How do you guys deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, we just stuck to it's mandatory. It's an expectation, right? And if I just take a step back, look, do I think that we're going to change the hearts and minds of everybody in the organization? No, probably not, right? But the training is required. So the expectation is that you complete the training. And then outside of that, there's always going to be an expectation that you are acting in a manner that follows our company values, policies, guidelines, and code of conduct.
So, and when you do this training, who does it? Like, do you outsource this? Like, if a company wanted to say, all right, we need to start doing this, who would they call? How would they start that process of planning this kind of training?
Yeah, we did. So, we have a chief learning officer that partnered with our global DE&I organization. And then we had an external person come in and host the training, multiple sessions throughout the year in relatively small groups, I would say. Small being like, let's call it like 100, don't quote me on that, but somewhere around there. And they just hosted them all throughout the year.
Gotcha. And then do you get feedback, like are there questionnaires to say I liked it or I learned something, or
yeah, there's opportunity for dialogue throughout the training, and then I believe we collected feedback after the trainings as well. And then kind of use that feedback as we develop the next round of training, right? As we went deeper into the organization, I think that was taken into account as well.
Okay. So May, how does Toyota deal with this? Do you guys, I'm sure you do, but you have similar formal training, and how do you do it?
Yeah, we do. First, I want to start maybe a little bit as a contrarian in that I think implicit bias or unconscious bias training is a fundamental first step. But I think studies have shown in some ways it turns people off. And there's like that dissenting group that you were asking about, that it's not as effective as we would like. So for me, I think it's great to have a common language that kind of Elizabeth was talking about. Let's use the same definitions and same understanding, but taking a training and realizing that, okay, we all have biases. Ta-da! That's not transformational change, right? So I'm perhaps contrary in that piece. We do have unconscious bias training. Our people leaders are required to take it. But I'd say a training that perhaps I saw was more helpful, in my opinion, was active bystandership training. And that's what we made mandatory last year as an organization after, George Floyd's death. And I think the move to that is that everyone has core values, and that's what we try to speak to, right? I mean, whether it is speaking up for the underdog or just speaking up against injustice. And that's what we use to really motivate people. And with that training, we got a lot of great feedback that people really liked, that it wasn't, I don't know why there's so much sensitivity around diversity, equity, inclusion, but the bystander piece really kind of brought everyone along. So that's one thing that really worked. And the second is that it's optional, it's not mandatory, but there's inclusivity training as a leader. I mean, you don't have to be a leader to take it. I really like that because the message was just about being welcoming. Are you being welcoming as leader to everyone? And there's less focus on race, ethnicity, protected categories, and more about, are you an inclusive leader? Do you seek out other people's opinions? And so I find that's more effective, in my opinion, than unconscious bias training.
Well, the active bystander training sounds pretty interesting. And it made me think of a term that I see at the Dallas Holocaust Museum, where it's all over the walls, where they call that an upstander as opposed to a stander.
Yes.
Which really it impacted me when the first time I saw it. So I thought, I've never heard that before, but it immediately makes sense. And you mentioned earlier that you took the Harvard test, which is the IAT. I believe.
Recording in progress.
Is that something that you do as part of your training for employees or leadership? Do they take that test in the training, or is that just you being May and going above and beyond?
It's just me being May. We don't require it. And if you geek out a little bit, there have been some contrary studies that it may not be as impactful, or there could be problems with the study or whatever. But I found it just because I was curious. I did it was curious. We don't require that at work.
Right. So can you talk a little bit more about the bystander training? Because I think that's really interesting. Like, is this, and again, I really want to get into not just the content of it, but how does one design these programs and start to implement them if you're watching this?
Yeah, we found out about this training from the National Conflict Resolution Center, which is out of, I think, University of San Diego in California. They do a live training. We learned that, just benchmarking a couple of other companies do it. And so we previewed it, and then now it's live. And so what we did was make it e-training. So we worked with that vendor, that organization, to create training just for us. using our core values, corporate values, all the companies that we're talking to today have, certain things they emphasize. So that's how it came about. And the why is really, it's hard to speak up. It's not helpful to say, if you see something, say something, because human nature, it's awkward. I really look the other way. What if someone comes after me? I'm only 4'10". There's a whole lot of reasons. There are more reasons perhaps to be quiet and look the other way. We hear all the time, people will record altercations instead of help a fellow human being out, right? Is it because we're inherently evil or whatever? Or is it because there are a lot of reasons why we won't speak up, right? And so the training is really looking like, okay, well, let's talk about all the reasons you will speak up. And fundamentally, it's shared core values. I'm a good person. I would want someone to speak up for me or whatever. And so that's what we focus on.
So from our perspective, we included that in our training, but what's unique, one of the things is you have to do things differently. So we just launched a merit badge for our youth from 11 to 17, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And it's having those discussions, talking about being an upstandard, welcoming environment, talking about different identities, what you feel comfortable with, meeting them at their journey. And that's where it's been great. The youth have embraced it. The families are divided. And lots of feedback. Is this critical race theory? What's going on? What are you doing? But I think that's where we need to influence our youth. And that's where I'm excited to be part of a bigger change. Because as adults, we're set in our biases. And my daughters really influence me because they're half white and half Mexican American. And so sometimes my biases, I'll say something and go, no, Mom, that's just you being you. It's not because you're Latina. It's just your biases. I'm like, oh. So what I like about the Boy Scouts is we've implemented having exercises where youth to have, it's 11 requirements they have to do. It's required to be an Eagle Scout or else you can't be an Eagle Scout, which is the pinnacle of who we are. And I like that. I think that's part of the change to influence, the adults who don't always listen. It's having the conversations with, their parents saying, what about this? What about that? And I think that's where we're at and what everyone's saying, May. And you have to have those conversations too.
Mark, if I may, I just want to address one of the questions we had in the Q&A chat function. It's to Elizabeth's point of doing things differently. We have someone who provided an anecdote on their time at a company where leadership didn't necessarily look like them. Right. And it goes to the ultimate question of what are companies doing, or what would you suggest that companies do to kind of have a more reflective culture or leadership structure of the outside or external culture that we are experiencing. So it goes to the concept of doing things differently. I wanted to throw that to the group here too.
I don't know if anyone has an immediate answer. I will say for my own part, one of the things that I probably started doing 2 or 3 years ago, in fact, it was through some training that May and I did together through the DAYL years ago, was every room I walk into, whether it's a party in my backyard or an office meeting or a client meeting, I always try and take account of who's in the room with me. Mm-hmm. And the results of that personal study is that I find that I hang out with a lot of white men. And so I've gotten to the point now where I've tried to start being a little bit more intentional with my guest lists and things like that when I plan events or do outings. To make sure that I am being inclusive, and I think through who am I not inviting that I probably should, and it's made for some much more diverse groups and more interesting conversation and different decision making coming out of a lot of those, especially when they're civic or political type activities. So I don't know, does anyone else do anything like that or catch yourself?
Yeah, I think what we need to realize as attorneys, we have the power to make change, be part of the change. I was the employment attorney for the Boy Scouts. And again, it's a very white organization. I'm one of the few Latinos, not that much color at all. And I think it's being in an organization, being part of the change and raising your hand to say, this is not okay and why. I'm the first Latina to be in the executive leadership team. Here's an organization for 111 years old, white males. So we have to be part of the change. We have to be part of the workforce groups or employee resource groups. We need to be doing things. And we can as attorneys, all of us are employment, not all of us, but May and Aida, we're employment attorneys. We see the discrimination, but I think you have to take a personal role and leadership role to be part of the change too, not just expect everyone, but have a voice, join, your employee resource groups, talk to other mentors, have sponsorships, people that you know are in leadership positions, and use your relationships with them.
And do you guys have any, like, how do you make, especially maybe your younger employees or even the boys that are participating as scouts, is there any kind of formal program where you try and intentionally make them feel more comfortable talking about some of these topics, especially, you know, in a situation where maybe you have some pushback from families? Like, how do you foster the conversation?
So that's why we did the merit badge, to get in front of the youth and the parents so they understand it. So think about it. You have every parent that's saying, what is this? I want to understand what these 11 requirements are. So if we get anything out of it, the parents are reading what diversity, equity, inclusion, we have a base foundation of definitions, and then going through scenarios. So that's how we did it. So we put it in context of 11 things, how to become welcoming, inclusive, understanding different identities, and having them engage, because a lot of these troops or youth are in basically similar situations. It may be an all Hispanic troop, it could be an all Asian troop, but learning how to ask people different questions. So we put it in the context so they could be in a safe space to have those conversations for the youth. The adults, it's a little bit harder. I mean, as a chief diversity officer, I've gotten pros and cons about doing this. It just comes back, people are very emotional, don't tell me what to do. So I think that's kind of where we're trying to find that space to get people to say, we're not telling you what to do, we're just trying to be inclusive and understand different perspectives. I don't know, May, Rita.
Yeah, I think you touched on something, Elizabeth, though. If the first time that you're having a conversation with someone is to talk about race or to talk about diversity, inclusion, equity,
yeah,
it's probably not, I mean, it may not be a very successful conversation, right? Depending on, the key is like, what type of relationship do you have with this person, or did you have with this person prior to, and what is the context? So I think, you know, Mark, to your point, there is a level of intentionality, right, on an organization level, as an individual, right, of making sure that you're not just falling back into the way that you've always done things because it's comfortable. Even if it's not for nefarious reasons, if you go back to doing what you've always done, you're going to keep getting the same results that you've always been getting. So you need to be somewhat intentional and internally reflective on how you're doing things and why you're doing them. But I think another part of driving, you know, any sort of DE&I, DIB, you know, however we phrase it, agenda is also indirect, right? Like when you think about leaders, you know, I don't know that we have a set way that we would influence, let's call it like a younger generation, but as leaders, I think I would call it a duty, right? Like to be a good leader, you can't just care about the parts of your employee that generate profit for the organization. That's not how that works. You might drive results for a short-term period of time. I don't think that makes you a good leader. I think a good leader is somebody that cares about their team as a whole, right? That cares about their team, their potential, their success, the things that keep them up at night. And so if you are nurturing this relationship from an authentic place over time, you will inevitably create an environment where you can broach these topics, right? Where you can have these conversations. And then I think people are a lot less defensive about it because they know you care about me. They know there's no hidden agenda. You've already established what your commonalities are, like what you have in, you know, similarities, et cetera, shared experiences. It becomes a lot harder to have those more difficult conversations, I think.
Hey, did you have any comment on that? And Alvin, feel free to jump in anytime. I see you shake your head a lot like you got something to say. I mean, we like looking at you and everything, but.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, Mark, like kudos to you to first. I remember that training first, you know, applying that and being intentional and just realizing. One of my favorite speakers in the DEI space is Emmanuel Acho, and I read his book. And I love what he says that resonates with me so much is that it's about culture, right? Like people have, and the reason why I talk about culture is because it takes out of race, it takes it out of, you know, it's small town versus growing up urban. It is whether you're first generation or not. It is, you know, traditions and everything. So culturally, if you've grown up, you know, with only, for example, if I only grew up with Asian people or white people or whatever, like that adds to it, right? And so I love that you're really intentional about it. When I think about, you know, as an organization, how to make change, I think it's two prongs. you want to look at systemic change, and that's a lot harder to do, especially if you're in a larger organization. But it sounds like even with you, Elizabeth, in a smaller organization, right, that transformational systematic change is really hard to do. But I'd like probably this audience to also think about like starting small, right? Starting with intentions like Mark of just that. I personally kind of did something the same. Like I intentionally mentor people who are not like me. So certainly I have Asian American, mentees, but I specifically seek out African American, Latinx mentees. One, because I want to be committed to that, right? Like I want to walk the walk. But second, I'm learning so much, right, from that. And what they call it is reverse mentoring. And that's and the tie into the company is that our company has started doing that, where our people leaders are in a reverse mentoring relationship, someone outside of their culture, so that there can be that kind of cross, that learning going both ways.
As far as I can tell, you probably have at least 100 mentees. So that's a large pool of people.
May's real good about that. She's the leader on that. Very proud of her.
Absolutely, she is. So, I found this group called the Royal Society, and everything on their website was with an English accent. So I assume that they are across the pond, as they say. And they had 4 little bullet points that they suggested that people do around this issue. And the first one was to just slow down decision making, right? Because we all have this tendency to make snap judgments, move quickly. That thing looks good enough. We're just going to go with it. And so to slow down just a little bit and give some more thought. Specifically, in the second one, is consider the reasons for your decision. Why did I do that? Why did I write Alvin's name at the top of my list? I don't know still, but I'll keep thinking about it. 3, question the cultural stereotypes. We all grow up in different cultures and have different ideas and thoughts, especially those of us who grew up in fairly homogeneous societies. And I grew up in Oklahoma, and there was not a lot of interaction with people that didn't look like me. And so moving to Dallas in my early 20s was a real experience when I got here, really trying to figure out who was what and why. But it really was those interactions with people that weren't like me that made me start to question everything, much to the chagrin of most of my family. But I think it's worked out pretty well. So question those cultural stereotypes, ask why do they exist, and why do I think that way? And then the fourth one is accountability amongst each other. Be monitoring the people around you, not in a judgmental, hateful way, but in a, hey, well, why'd you do that? And get them to ask these same questions to themselves. So in your organizations, is there any kind of accountability? Do you publish metrics? Is there any kind of consequence if these metrics aren't followed, or how do you guys think about that at all to see if you're being successful, if these programs are working, and that you are actually getting the results you're looking for by doing all this training and getting people to realize this?
So I can jump in. In terms of consequences, if we talk about the training, for example, I don't know if there's consequence, it's hard to measure that on an individual basis when people come out of the training. I think from a consequence perspective, the expectation would be, again, right, you're acting in a way that's consistent with our values, with our code of conduct, et cetera. And if we become aware of you not doing that, right, that gets addressed accordingly, as it would for anybody else. In terms of accountability, though, right, again, ensuring that it was a mandatory training, ensuring that everybody gets trained. In terms of our broader goals, from our REJ, there is a level of transparency, right? We made the decision to publish our EEO1 report. It's on our external website. We did that last year and updated it again this year. And then we published our first ever workforce demographics report, which shows a breakdown of our population by race and gender, gender globally, and then race within the US. And that's also publicly available. And it's something that's constantly under review. It's something that's always being worked on. It's an active journey, I would say. And I think there is an expectation for leaders, right, to make sure that they're acting in a way that helps us reach our goals, right? Now do it in the right way, right? As an employment lawyer here still, like I'm not saying go out and make race-based hiring decisions. I'm not saying any of that, right? But Mark, I love the way that you said it at the start of the call. If you have a really broad applicant pool, what I love about what you said is you're more likely to find the best talent, right? And I think a lot of times organizations, people get hung up on, you want the most diverse pool so that you have a higher chance of hiring a diverse candidate. But maybe we all need to be shifting our thinking, right? You just want a diverse set of pools so that you have the best shot at getting the best person for the job. And oh, by the way, right, the other added benefit is you're going to get a more diverse set of people within that pool. So that's kind of our take on that.
Hey,
We are a little bit behind Pepsi's journey in being as public, I think, about what we do. But certainly there's a lot of work done internally to move the needle, so to speak. And it really comes like my chief legal officer, Sandra Phillips Rogers, is also the chief diversity officer. So there's there's a lot of power behind that. As far as accountability, we do believe it starts at the top. So our leaders have a diversity scorecard. I can't share all the details about it, but the purpose, the why behind having it is making sure that our leaders reflect the values of our company and make sure that diversity is top of mind and not just check the box. So that's something that we do. And as far as training, when it's mandatory, yeah, like if you don't do it, you could be terminated. But luckily, most people get that. And it's really interesting because like as we get, and we actually have to follow up with people's stuff. And as it gets toward, the holiday, our chief human resources officer will call you if you haven't taken it. And luckily we haven't had him have to call anybody.
that's fantastic.
Our perspective, we publish the results, and we're transparent about that. We have a lot of work to do. I think what I'm very clear as the chief director is we're on a journey. We're at the beginning of the journey, and we have a lot of work to do. We do require training for our employees, so we mandate that or they'll be terminated. Again, we can't. My thought for the volunteers, it doesn't help to mandate it because a lot of them are in corporations, already get it, so it's getting the buy-in. But yeah, we haven't looked at metrics yet because that's the next step. And I think that's one of the things what you've said, Mark, is that we need to take a step back. Sometimes I got this role a year ago. Let's just make all these changes and not understand what we're doing. Again, it really is, what is your culture? What are you trying to do? And where are you going? And to everyone's point, we're going to get to unconscious bias. We touched it a little bit in our foundational training, but that's the next step because I needed to build the foundation of let's understand the basic terms and where we're coming from to put people in a safe space. So when they see the next training on unconscious bias, we spend more time. They're like, okay, I get it. So that's what we've been doing. I've been more intentional about not rushing because there's not one right way to do it. That was one of the things that, I'm an attorney, there's a right way to do this. It's understanding your culture and what you're trying to do and for it to resonate and get buy-in. And that's something that I'm very cognizant of. So I love hearing from May, and you guys are far ahead, but we're part of that journey making those changes.
So I don't know if this is just my own experience here, but let's assume that I was the CEO or some higher up in your company, and we were having a conversation about this, and I said to you, I like the idea. I'm concerned that I will look inauthentic, like I'm just doing it to do it because the market demands or in response to public outcry. How would you guys respond to someone like that? Because I do definitely hear people have those conversations, especially older white men who are afraid that they won't look authentic. And I think in some cases, I've even seen that lead to inaction, which is probably not the best result. So how would you counsel that person to get them to move in the right direction?
Well, so oh yeah, I mean, I was thinking for me, with that leader, kind of chiming in on what Aida was saying, I think it starts with building trust, right? And having a leader who is vulnerable and authentic. So maybe, this hypothetical, my leader might not have a specific story that he feels or she feels, I guess in your scenario it's he, that resonates with, race or ethnicity or things like that. But I think after a conversation and getting him to understand it's about culture, like, oh, so did you grow up in small town Texas, or did you grow up in Manhattan? And when you get to know someone and then making the connection for them that it is cultural, like it's about cultural differences, and we don't want anyone to feel less than just because they have a different, culture. I think that's where you start, and quite frankly, we can train all we want, but where I see people personally move is through narratives, personal anecdotes. It's like when a leader that you think has got their crap together, is suddenly saying, man, I'm really struggling with this. I have no idea what direction we should take. What do you think? I mean, there's just something that draws you in because they're more human or more vulnerable. So I think that's where I would start.
So I actually have that scenario, Mark. My CEO is a white 75-year-old man, very conservative, but he is the biggest advocate. It's building that relationship, because he's a white male. He's like, I never thought about that. And I would walk him through scenarios of, well, imagine being a Latina, imagine this and that. He goes, I didn't think about that. And we need to be inclusive, and how we're not being inclusive in the scouting environment. Building that relationship, and then also knowing who he is. One of the suggestions was like, he needs to put his pronouns. Well, he's not going to put pronouns. That's not who he is. It's not authentic to have a 75 white and say, he's not going to do that. And so it's just understanding who your CEO is, understanding his strengths and weaknesses, and building that rapport. I've been here with him a year now. And so we have that rapport to have very candid, direct conversations and understand what's going to work and not. And he is one of the biggest advocates, even though you would look at him like him, but I wouldn't put a pronoun on his title. I'd say it's not authentic. So it's just knowing who your audience is and who the CEO is.
Yeah, Mark.
Go ahead, Alvin. Go ahead.
No, I've heard someone reference the distinction between not attempting to be anyone else. That's not necessarily saying be yourself.
Right.
That's giving you the space to grow, but not necessarily use someone as a cookie cutter example of what to do. And I think there's like a kind of gray area or a mixture of how you accomplish that. I'm sorry, Aida.
No. There's no need to apologize. I'm thinking through this now, like live, right? So forgive me if I don't get this wrong, but can somebody be inauthentic, or do they do things that are inauthentic, right? Like, and here's what I'm saying. Like, how can you, if you're just being who you are, that's not necessarily inauthentic, right? That's who you are. You can't help who you are. I think inauthenticity comes in with action, right? If you do something that does not match with who you are, that is inauthentic, right? So like Elizabeth, to your example, if your CEO put his pronouns and that doesn't necessarily line up to who he is as a person, that
right.
action is inauthentic. But him just being who he is,
right,
that is literally authenticity. Like that's what it is.
It is.
Who you are. So I think, if I had a leader that was asking that question or sharing that sentiment, I think I would start with questions, right? Like if you're worried about being inauthentic, why are you worried about that? What exactly do you think is going to come across as inauthentic, right? I would ask, why are we on this journey, right? Let's level set. Are we on this journey to do what we said we're going to do because we think it's the right thing to do? Or are we doing it just for publicity, et cetera? Because those are also two very different courses of action. And if the answer is we're doing this because it's true to our values, to our core, to who we are, we want to impact societal change, then I think that leader's got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Right.
And being less concerned with appearing inauthentic and more concerned with being authentic. And I think the other thing is that is not something that you're going to solve over time. You're not going to be able to control people's opinions about, yourself. But if you show up consistently over an extended period of time, continuing to do the work, then people will understand that your actions are authentic over time. But you may not flip that switch for everyone right away. And again, you just have to be comfortable with, what are we trying to do? What is the why behind all of this? and Brene Brown has this great quote that I love, which is, we should be more concerned with getting it right than being right. And I think that's the space that leader sounds like they're in, right? Don't worry about fumbling. You're not going to be perfect. You're not going to get this thing right and knock it out of the park every single time. But again, come back to what your why is, and then just keep showing up over time. And hopefully we will get it right as an organization.
So let me flip this question on its head.
Add really quick, Mark. I think though is action, right? Allyship has to be action.
Yep.
Say all the things you want and do the press releases and all that, but I think there has to be visible action.
Follow through.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Mark, one quick question, one thing, because I see a question that's kind of related to this. There's also the component of education, right? Like, how can you be inauthentic or authentic if you don't know any better? So, Aida, you mentioned doing the work. I think there's a component of doing the work, and I know at Capital One we have a program where all of our VP plus population takes training. It's called Capital One Racial Equity, and it's basically like, I looked at it, it's basic history. It's basic history and understanding certain power structures, certain systems, in terms of kind of like how we arrived at the place that we are right now, which goes to one of the questions, which is there are a number of claims that draw the distinction between D&I training and critical race theory. And how do you feel about that tie-in, despite the fact that those claims are likely wrong or erroneous? So I wanted to make sure that question got on the floor.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I took critical race theory as a class in law school. Like that was, I remember taking it, and now when I hear that phrase like kind of bandied about, I have a lot of moments of like, that's not critical race theory. Like that's basic core values. Like that's basic like diversity and inclusion. That's my personal opinion on it. I think everybody has a friend in Google. We have an internet out there that has all of this information, and people can self-educate and really understand the difference between CRT and diversity, inclusion, et cetera. The issue becomes, do they want to do that, right? You can't force people, as an organization, you can require training. Elizabeth, I love your point about recognizing where you are in your journey, right? And developing the training that is appropriate for your organization at that time. You can do that inside the workplace, but outside of the workplace, you can't force people to, look that up and educate themselves. So they're just not the same thing. And I think the way you address that from an organizational standpoint is Elizabeth's example. Take the pulse of where your company is, give the training that's appropriate, but understand, to May's point, that is just the first step.
Right.
It shouldn't be the end all be all. You level set and then you build from there.
So back to the last scenario that we were talking about with the old white executive. I want to turn that around just a little bit and look the other direction. And I hope this isn't an ignorant question, but I have had people tell me in the past that they felt at their jobs like they were just being propped up as a token, right? They're on all the literature. They have to lead the D&I committees. Is that a widespread feeling? Is that a small thing? How do you guys think about that? And I think this ties into the authenticity question, is just how do you make the people of color and the women in your organizations that you're trying to help with these programs really feel like it's serious and you're not just using them for a PR campaign? Not everyone at once.
I'm processing it.
Yes, I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah.
I have personally felt that way before. And I'll tell you, again, it's the actions, right? Like I have been taken to a client pitch and then I never see any of the work afterwards. I'm not allowed to talk to the client. I don't, and that's not a unique, and I'm not suggesting this happened to me several times. It has happened once. And it's not a unique story, right? You take any person, different setting. It may not be a firm, it may be, internal, et cetera, but chances are you have a lot of people, particularly within your people of color, women, et cetera, that have felt that way. And again, it's the what you do is inconsistent with what you've held yourself out to be, right? Like you've held us out to be this diverse team, but in reality, the actions don't follow through. And that's where I think people end up feeling like tokens. May, sorry, you might have been able
Yeah,
to.
no, I was trying to think like, okay, so if we agree that this is a common experience, not necessarily universal, but a common experience, you know, for audience members, what would our suggestion be to do about it? Now you need to have psychological safety, right? You have to feel like the safe place at work. I mean, luckily I do feel very safe at work. So if I'm given the honor of being the face of diversity or whatever, I personally like to take small steps to see how I can use that, right? Like if you're going to give me the spotlight, I hope that when I suggest to you that at the next webinar we do, you know, the last couple of ones were all white men, and hey, that's not a great look for us. That you know, I hopefully I can get my toe in there to also make that change. So I don't know if that advice is great if you don't want to be the token, but for me, like, well, if you're going to give me the platform, let me see if I can kind of take it, you know.
Yeah, that's what I did. So I'm in a safe space where I'm at. I had a candid conversation with my CEO. I'm like, I'm not just going to be in this position to be the token. If that's the case and I don't see diversity moving forward, then I'm stepping down and I'll be back. I'll be the employment attorney. But we're not always in that safe space. So I think what they have to look at is, are you in a safe space? And if you are, you have a candid conversation. If you're not, then you need to look for another company. I think we've all been in corporations. We've been somewhere in our life where we're not in a space we feel comfortable. And we know it's not. And so it's incumbent upon you to look at who am I and what do I want? I mean, when we're younger attorneys, you tend to take a lot more. As you get older, you're like, this is not the right environment for me. I'm going to do this. So I think you have to look at yourself and say, can I do it financially too? I mean, sometimes you just can't say I'm not doing this because you got to look at where you're at and are you in a safe space, and whatever you do, you're committed to. And if you say, this isn't going to work, then I'm prepared to step down as a chief diversity officer. I'm prepared for that, but you got to be prepared for your actions, not just say it, but commit to it. But make sure you're in a safe space, because if you're not, then more than likely it's not going to go your direction and you get frustrated and it's not the right organization for you. That's just being candid with everyone. I think we've all been there where we've left.
Yeah. And I think if you do get to a position of power like you, Elizabeth, you know, where we've perhaps are older and wiser and have been through it, I think it's important to leverage that, right? To try to push if we can, because I think otherwise it won't get moved. And if I may, I think that's why we've been talking about D&I for years, right? And why haven't we moved as much? Well, maybe it's because we've been putting it on the shoulders of the people, color and women, right? But if we widened that obligation, that really is for everyone to effectuate, maybe we'd see change faster.
Yeah, I think I like to interpret it as psychological safety creates candor or candid conversations. Candid conversations then, and the way to mitigate this thing and for the companies that we represent are having those forms of continuous feedback. Because if the feedback loop is closed and then someone says something and it's not implemented or it's not necessarily truly considered, then you kind of cut it off. It has to be a continuous feedback loop and also implementation or consideration of that feedback that creates the change that we need. One question from the comments. I know we've talked about allyship earlier, and I think based on the companies here, I feel pretty comfortable saying that these companies have programs to develop and promote allyship. But what about sustaining allyship? Are there any things you guys do specifically to sustain allyship?
Maybe you take this question yourself, Alvin.
Yeah.
yeah, I'm happy to. Aida, you mentioned like our ERGs, we call them BRGs at Capital One. And we have a number of entities based on various demographics, cultural demographics, gender. We actually have a military service BRG as well. And we also have partner allyship or ally organizations that support those groups. So it goes to the question you raised, Mark, earlier, which is, you know, the straight white male who wants to be involved or wants to get engaged in various points it creates a level of comfort and inclusion for those individuals too, because I can understand the awkwardness of coming. Our Black BRG is called Voices. I can understand the awkwardness of coming to the Voices BR event or a meeting and, you know, not necessarily knowing anyone, but just be willing to help out. So we've created these kind of programs that allow for allyship for similarly situated persons who want to support a particular cause, to kind of galvanize and have a conversation and support in their own specific way.
Well, thank you, Alan. Unfortunately, I think we're about out of time. It's 12:59. I've got to cut it off and be a good host for all the people watching that are ready to go back to work. So, but thank you guys for participating today. I thought that was a great conversation, and I hope everyone watching enjoyed it. And I'm sure that we'll see you next time. So thank you.